So Erkang Zheng is the CEO and founder of JupiterOne. Uh, Previous to founding JupiterOne, Erkang was the CISO for Lifomic and led software security for Fidelity Investments. And Erkang, what I said in the previous in my warm up was, as a past and current customer of Fidelity, I'm sure that you did a lot to protect my investments, as small as they may have been, and I appreciate that. But so with that, Erkan, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I will be here to help you with whatever you need, and we'll have some questions or time for Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And I did what I could, and I'm glad that your money is still there. So like you mentioned, right? So I've been a security practitioner for all my career, and throughout that journey, I've had a lot of firsthand challenges in solving different security operational issues with organizations large and small. And especially as we go through this digital transformation and starting to adopt cloud technologies and resources, I see that security is again at a point of revolution, right? So before I get to starting to share that story, I want to first thank you for the event organizer for EVOTEK and for MTEK for the summit, right? So you have an amazing line of speakers. I've been through the sessions this morning, and appreciate you guys being an organization that focus and support on innovation and the digital innovators in the world. With that, let me bring up my slides. Okay, well, hopefully you can see my slides. Okay. All right then. So as I mentioned, right, so what are the challenges that I am seeing, and what do we need to do for this new future of cybersecurity? And the highlight here I wanted to discuss is really we should look at cybersecurity as a wellness program for an organization. And I've seen security practitioners playing cops, right? So being the police of the organization all the time, and that oftentimes doesn't really work out that well, and it hasn't been. And what we really need to shift the mindset to and shift the operating model to is to becoming the wellness coaches and the doctors in cyberspace rather than being the police, the cops. And to do that, what we really need to get to is focus on the data and doing the basics, right? So doing the hygienes and doing the just like personal wellness and consumer health or personal health. There's a lot of things that are similar. So that begins with understanding assets and relationships. That is the fundamental data elements within an organization today. Everything is becoming digital. We've heard previous speakers talk about the digital transformation. Every company is becoming a technology company, and so on and so forth. So first of all, then, what are we talking about, right? So what do we mean by assets and relationships? And many times when people think about assets, they feel like, well, here's a device and here's something that has an IP address, maybe here's an application, and so on and so forth. But instead, what we really need to rethink is everything that is software defined, everything that is ephemeral, every workload, every process, every piece of technology, and digital identities, for example, are assets. A user account somewhere, or a code repository somewhere, or a pull request, changes that developers made to those code, and where are those deployed, and how are they connected, and the relationships, right? All of those are assets. And when we talk about visibility to this asset, it really depends on understanding the relationships so that we can answer questions that matter. We can answer the so what questions, not just the what questions, right? So we have to know ourselves before we can protect ourselves. And just very much similar to personal health and medical and wellness. And we have to understand our own human bodies and DNAs, right? So before we can truly protect and defend against the diseases and the pathogens and so on out there. And we're in a pandemic right now. I think that is a pretty timely and relevant topic. And in terms of cyber, we've heard this before. Attackers think in connected model, they think in graphs, and defenders, we often operate with checklists, right? Compliance and whatnot. And that model has to change. So that's why with JupiterOne, right? So we build our technology on a graph to understand this complex data and model that out in order to answer questions. So with this, right? So what do you think? Does this remind you of anything, right? So to me, it reminds me of this revolution that has been in the healthcare space, right? So we've seen the maturity of DNA sequencing and using genomic technologies to treat diseases and illness, and and all of these are grounded in the understanding of the very basic elements of data within human bodies. And I'm talking about the same things for cyberspace. And we have to do this for digital organizations. Again, that is digital organizations and the assets and the relationships within the digital organizations. So let's make this more practical and operational like this. And what do we do, right? So to me, going back to my previous experiences as former CISOs and security leaders, and these are the key pillars I see at a program level, right? Not at a control level, but at a program level of cybersecurity. Well, first of all, we have to have this fundamental visibility and context and understanding of what we have, who owns them, how are they connected, and how do they relate to each other. And with that context and with that visibility, we can then do all sorts of things, right? So that's the data and understanding and the knowledge that enable us to do the right things in security operations, security engineering, which can include abstract detection and response, vulnerability management, and many, many things. And that's also what enables us to perform risk assessment, risk management, security posture management, whether you're in the cloud or not. And all of these configuration monitoring, applying policy as code, detecting violations and drifts in those configurations, and just maintaining basic security hygiene across the board relies on that fundamental set of data and assets. And of course, and we should not make compliance and governance a separate initiative or a different or an afterthought, right? So, and we've heard early on this morning, Enrique talk about and the folks and organizations with these kind of compliance mindset of GDPR and so on and so forth, and design these into the process and the product that we build in the business, becoming an enabler and accelerator for the business. At the same time, what we also realize that is compliance doesn't equal security often case. And but what we need to do to make that more aligned together, right? So those two are go hand in hand, security and compliance. And in order to do that, we have to continuously provide the evidence collection, metrics, and reporting to support audits in a continuous manner, and not a point in time, once a year type of exercise. So that's how we build JupiterOne. So JupiterOne essentially is this platform that is cloud native, and it aggregates data from different sources and different IT controls, different security controls, different infrastructure environments like the major cloud providers, and also on-prem data sources. But additionally, like I mentioned, right, so it's not just about infrastructure, it's not just about devices and things with an IP address, it's about every single workload, every single digital identity, and every single resource across the entire digital operations. Be it the development organization, there are resources in GitHub, right? So these Git repos and developer making changes to them, or end user devices, endpoints, or even security awareness trainings, and so on and so forth. So what we're doing, or what we should do as an organization to leverage this massive amount of data that's now across hundreds of different environments, is the ability to aggregate them into one system of record. Now, this system of record then becomes the knowledge base, right? Becomes this kind of DNA sequencing data that continuously evolve as your organization changes, and to help provide the visibility and understanding into the program. And not only do we need to aggregate this data, we need to make use the best way to automate the ability for the security team and for the analysts to be able to understand it. And in order to do that, what we do, right, so as JupiterOne, is we normalize that data and we connect them into a data model that is based on a graph, and to really highlight the relationships and the connectivities of these resources among themselves. And this gives us the ability to truly visualize and understand all the resources we have. And that is what provides the context that's much needed in order to do the right things and prioritize and focus on the right tasks on any given day across all of these operational pillars, and ultimately achieve this continuous governance and compliance across the entire digital operations. And I'll give you a couple of examples here, right? So I want to make it very specific, and I'll tell you a couple of the stories of how some of our customers leverage JupiterOne, or just these are just examples of how you can leverage data in such a graph model to provide a context in day-to-day operations. So we have our champions and early adopters and customers like Databricks and HashiCorp and so on that are using this to provide context for incident response. And for example, right, so if a SOC analyst or a security analyst gets an alert from a SIM 2 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday, now what do they do with it, right? So do they decide to wake somebody up, or is this something that can wait until Monday? Now, in order to answer that question, right, so not just the fact that I have situational awareness that something is under attack, but what I also need is the structural and environment context, and this data that talks about, or that provides all of these relevant information about this resource that is now under attack, and tell me so that I can gauge the priority and the severity of this potential attack. So questions like, well, is this device still active? What other resources are in the same blast radius? What does it have access to? And if I take this offline and start investigating, is this going to cause an outage? And here's an exact scenario, right? So in this graph, right, this is a screenshot that's taken out of JupiterOne, and you can enter a simple full text search to identify the resource that is under attack, right, from a particular alert of some detection system. And the graph tells you immediately about the resource itself and the connected environment. So you can see that the blast radius of this under the same subnet, there is a production instance in the same subnet. And this production instance, same as this original instance that's being alerted on, they're both internet facing. And there's a firewall rule or security group rule which is in AWS connecting them, allowing them access in and out of the internet. Now, at the same time, what we can also see this through the connections and relationships is that both of these two virtual instances share the same SSH key. And at this point, then alerts should be firing and say, well, if the original instance down below is under attack, it could very well lead to an attack of this production instance in the same subnet sharing the same SSH key. But let's not stop there, right? So we can immediately show you what it has access to and the findings that we can apply and overlay on top of these resources and the applications and the DNS records and are pointing to this production resource. And that is an example of how the graph and this configuration and this knowledge base can provide tremendous amount of context in a very short amount of time when time is of the essence in an incident scenario. Now here's another one, and this is an example in providing context in vulnerability management or application security. And we all do this, right? So we have in security, we have all sorts of different scanners that generate findings. And there are some examples, right? Could be Qualys, could be Tenable, could be Sneak, could be Veracode, right? So it could be a code scanner, it could be an infrastructure host scanner, whatever the case may be. And in most cases, right, so these scanners, they provide findings based on the scanning of that particular resource, whether that is a code repo or a virtual instance or a host. Now, it can generate a ton of them, a ton of findings, and there could be hundreds and thousands and maybe even more on a regular basis. Well, we don't have thousands of people, right, on the security team or even in the engineering team to work on these. So how do we truly identify the risk and be able to prioritize? So imagine that if we're able to provide the findings and correlate them to the owners who produce the findings, and they are the best to identify, right, if those findings are relevant to the things that they're working on. Now, additionally, what we can also do is we can correlate findings from one end to the other end, right? So in this case, we're correlating findings in code associated with the code repos, and then correlating them to where they're deployed. In this case, they're deployed to some Lambda functions. They run as ephemeral Lambda functions, serverless. And we can then also see that these functions have IAM roles and policies associated with them that grant them access to data stores in production that are classified as non-public. Now, all of a sudden, out of the thousands of findings that you may have, and these three are the ones that are probably most interesting or most critical to be prioritized and to be worked on. On the other hand, very similarly, right, so you can correlate findings to code and to resources that are internet facing. And to extend upon this example, you can also correlate findings from code to infrastructure resources that it has deployed to the workloads, where the workloads themselves may also have findings. So that is another interesting path that makes prioritization more meaningful. The third story. So the stories in the context in cloud security, and this is sometimes being known as CSPM, right? So the configuration and security posture management in the cloud. But it is more than just that, right? It is more than just monitoring and managing the configurations of the resources themselves. But as I've been talking about this, right, it's really understanding the relationships that connect the dots. In this case, there was a couple of years ago, there was a famous attack or exploit in S3 that happened to a financial organization. And the reason of that, it wasn't because that the S3 bucket itself was misconfigured to be open to the public. It was configured to be internal. However, there was a vulnerability associated with an EC2 instance that was publicly facing itself. And that EC2 instance had an instance profile that connected it via IAM policies and access to that internal bucket. So when that publicly facing EC2 instance was compromised, it actually led to the compromise of this internal bucket through these connections that are not directly necessarily associated with the S3 bucket configuration itself. So these are the examples of things that we can then leverage the data that is now in a graph data model, in a graph database, and write queries to apply as policy as code, or in this case, policy as queries, and map them to benchmarks, to compliance standards and requirements, both internal and externally, and provide this continuous analysis of those requirements and controls. So is it just security? Well, it's actually not just security. And we actually have ourselves, right? So we use JupiterOne internally, of course. And a lot of times our developers and our DevOps teams will leverage that to connect the dots and help drive some of the visibilities that the developers need. And in order to understand, for example, is the code running on any end of life systems? And components, right? So to identify those, or to identify if a developer had opened a pull request that has been deployed to a workload that has problems, right, or has alerts on those workloads. So the ability to extend the graph is almost infinite, right? So the use cases and can drive beyond security. And what this allows us to do is to bridge the gap that we often see between security and engineering, and allow them to have visibility on a common platform. And again, this one system record in order to perform oftentimes very complex analysis to bring these connections between the two organizations. Right. Last but not least, I mentioned the last pillar of this is continuous monitoring, continuous governance, and the queries can be used to create dashboards to visualize the different KPIs and reportings and drive compliance initiatives across the entire organization. So to sum this up, right? So what I truly believe is in order to look at security as a wellness program for an organization, and this modern approach has to be based on data and it has to be driven like an engineering solution with data and automation. So that's why I decided to build JupiterOne, and we've built this as a knowledge-based platform for focus on understanding the assets and relationships across the entire cyber digital operations, and also provide this as a platform for the security engineers to continue to build automations on top. And this can be a virtual assistant of sorts, right, to the operations team to ask questions and get answers at any moment in time, and as well as to provide the foundation to achieve continuous governance using policy as code or policy as queries, whether that is on the platform itself or using APIs to integrate with the workflow in an organization. And here at JupiterOne, right, our mantra has been to leverage this platform and this data to enable teams to know more and fear less. With that, John, do we have time
Yeah,
for
we,
questions?
we do, Erkang. That was tremendous. Kind of in my role as moderator of this session, it's kind of hard to not become a fan, right? Like a football announcer, you don't want them rooting for one team or the other. But I found myself having a hard time not saying, "Yes, you nailed it." Really good job. We do have a couple of questions already queued up, and I'll just fire off the first one. Can JupiterOne connect all of my company's security tools in a simple, unified experience in an open security platform that is sitting on a hybrid infrastructure, obviously public and private and on-prem, in a single pane of glass for analysts to see threats? A lot to
Yeah,
digest there, but I think you probably got it.
yeah, absolutely right. So I think as you said, right. So or as Stephen said, this is more of a softball question, and it is designed to do that exactly the thing that you described, right? So there's a lot of the out of the box connections that you can just turn on and enable and provide an API key or some sort of authentication, and we will auto discover and continue to maintain that sets of assets and map out those relationships and cross the environment as well, right? Not just within one account or one provider. And in terms of on-prem, JupiterOne is a platform itself with open APIs, very much like Splunk, right? So you can push any logs to Splunk, you can push any configuration data to JupiterOne as well.
Awesome. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I kept thinking as you were discussing the product, we always run the risk, or don't always, and it's not always we, but I think vendors and companies sometimes run the risk of trying to boil the ocean of security, and there's so many different aspects and functions and controls that you're addressing here, and seemingly in a very effective and efficient manner. Yeah,
That's
again,
right, and
yeah,
I often see that the organizations for the past decade or so, right, so started to go down the path of I want a best of breed of something, right? So, however, I think we are quickly starting to realize that the best of breed, if it's not connected to the rest of things, and to provide this connected understanding, may not be the best approach. Right, so I'm very much of an advocate of going back to the basics and understanding the basic well,
yeah,
before you get that Ferrari of something,
yeah.
right? So yeah,
Yeah, and you don't want to lock into, maybe the control du jour and have your entire mission statement be focused around one control that may or may not be an issue next year.
that's right.
And
That's
and,
right.
and when you showed the pillars that JupiterOne is focused on, I think it was extremely relevant to not only yes today's issues, but certainly as we kind of look into the future.
Yeah.
One thing that I see quite a bit, Erkan, is the need for companies to to really address compliance and governance. And I love the fact that you're thinking in that direction, but not only thinking, but doing something about it and operationalizing it. So
Yeah,
yeah, really,
thank you. And I believe that that cannot be separate, right? So as
yeah,
given my former background as a, consultant with IBM security, right? So we kind of corner the term that security doesn't equal compliance and vice versa.
yeah,
I really think that they should go more hand in hand
yep,
and not completely disconnected. Um,
yeah. And I mean, in the industry is demanding as such, in anymore. It can't be an afterthought, and like to your point, completely dependent on one another. So
that's right.
excellent optic.
Yeah.
Yep, really
And
good.
I think, John, if I can just kind of share this last thing, right? So as
Sure.
I mentioned that, this kind of cyber wellness concept, right? And, you know, I look at for us as well, right? So, if we say, hey, this heart attack may be a significant cause of death, right? So then, but is that something that you should just go off and run to Costco and buy a bunch of supplements that help you to prevent and improve your heart health, right? Is that the right thing? Or maybe you as an individual, I'm not saying you, John, right? So maybe as an individual that you have a genetic condition that makes you more suspicious to kidney function failure or whatever, right? So maybe that's the part that you want to focus more, right? Rather than just getting a bunch of supplements and taking everything off the shelf. And this is similar to, we should not just blindly apply best practices, right? So in cybersecurity, we should really focus on understanding
Yep.
our organization better, and in order to focus those limited resources.
Absolutely. Perfectly stated. And it sounds like Jupiter One, might you could market yourselves as we take the blinders off in a sense, right? Because you want to see the entire diagnosis versus focusing on one.
Right, right.
Yep, perfect. Well, hey, I can't thank you enough, and thank you, Erkang and Jupiter One, for participating in this really cool event, and you truly have made it cooler. So thank you,
Thank you,
and
John, and for organizing and having me here.
you're very welcome. Thanks, Erkang.
Bye.
All right, everybody, I'll see you in the next session.